those things because the intent behind Lent is to exchange something that you think draws you away from God in favor of being drawn back towards God. Now, I'm not going to challenge anyone's decision to stop eating chocolate or drinking Coke, but I am curious if doing those things actually draws you closer to God. I am curious about how giving something up without the intent of it being channeled back towards the call you've been offered actually helps us find our way back there. I think it's curious, too, that in our culture we have chosen to focus on the food part of Lent, even though two other really big things happen in the story and the text that Fred read for us this morning. There was a temptation to save oneself from certain death, and a temptation to take total and complete power. We never talk about the power piece. We have never once invited people to fast from power. Never once said, what would it look like if you stopped leading for 40 days and let someone else give that a shot? There's a whole other sermon that we could have this morning, and we won't. But it does tie into the reality that I think the church still is unable to answer the question tied to its relationship to power. There is something here about our discomfort with how the church engages with power, in part because the church is power. The church is part of the thing that we have decided to call empire. And I think we struggle with that reality, so we just don't talk about it. We just don't touch it. And we won't today. I preached on this text last year, and I will still focus, as I did last year, on this piece of the kingdoms of the world and their glory, because that is part of the power question. But I also want to briefly hit on each of the temptations and try to draw us toward the invitation that I see coming from Jesus in our text today. Jesus is tempted in really three simple ways. Give yourself food, save yourself from falling from a great height, and accept political empire power and rule over all the earth. In response to each of those temptations, Jesus resists. To the temptation to craft bread out of stone, Jesus replies, "One does not live by bread alone, but by word that comes from the mouth of God." To the temptation to fall from the mountain and call upon the angels to save him from near certain death, he replies, "Again, it is written, do not put God to the test." And to the temptation to rule the world while worshiping Satan, Jesus replies, "Worship the Lord your God and serve only God." Something happened there in those three short readings. Jesus claimed his human nature. In temptation, Jesus is challenged to do something that this figure we call Satan assigns only to a God. And yet, in response to every single temptation, Jesus relies upon the teachings of his faith. Not divine power, not divine authority. He relies upon the things he was taught by his mom and his dad, in a synagogue, in the school. He relies upon the teachings of his faith. In recounting that one does not live by bread alone, Jesus is reaching back to the story of the Israelites in the desert receiving manna from heaven. In recalling that one shouldn't put God to the test, he again is recalling stories from Deuteronomy where that rule comes from. And that rebuke at the end to worship and serve only God, also a reconnection to the book of Deuteronomy. This is a powerful literary and faith device. Deuteronomy is the final book of the Torah, and it recounts most of God's saving acts in history up to that point, while also preparing us for the acts to come. In rooting his resistance in that text, Jesus is showing us that the lived practice of his faith is tied to the faith, the teaching, and the traditions of his ancestors. His resistance is an act of memory. He is fully human in that resistance, too. And all of this that we've talked about so far this morning begins to happen in wildness. Now, throughout Lent, you will often hear wildness in place of wilderness, and it's an intentional effort to invite our participation in a new way of understanding the places we end up in life. Wilderness is often equated with the desert or some other unique place that we have to travel to in order to discern what God is calling us into. Wildness, as a new term, seeks to go beyond the common connotations of wilderness and instead come to understand that wildness is all around us. We can and do encounter wildness in ordinary places because it is an ordinary place. Wildness is grief. Wildness is uncertainty. Wildness is despair. Wildness is our neighborhood, our families, our churches. A place where our sense of control falls away and is supplanted instead by an emerging sense of clarity. Wildness is the place where our faith is indeed challenged and where the possibilities of our imaginations begin to take root. Wildness is the place where we are perhaps best able to discern our call. In this place, we're invited to follow the way of Jesus and draw upon our faith as a sustaining source of resistance to temptations and as healthy support for the work and the road ahead. In the Old Testament reading that Fred read this morning, our decision to read that text also an act of memory, Jeremiah challenges us to root ourselves in our resistance to the temptations of empire. And I think he notes that there are rarely quick fixes for oppression, rarely one neat trick you just haven't tried yet. Instead, Jeremiah counsels those in exile, living under and in an oppressive state, to resist through faithfulness, through a particular kind of rootedness. Jeremiah says, settle down, plant gardens, raise families, seek peace, seek prosperity. That isn't any of the excitement and energy of showing up to a protest or signing a letter. But it's the kind of thing that people in power actually have a really hard time defeating. It's actually not that difficult to navigate around a protest. In fact, I think the U.S. has developed a really interesting protest process where people get permits and marshals, and they tell those in power exactly when they're going to meet, where they're going to meet, who's going to be there, what route they will take, and where they will ultimately gather. That is protest in the U.S. It often is actually very safe. It often is actually very comfortable. And there are some folks who will look at that and say, these are never really protests, they're simply rallies that help us feel better about ourselves. And that's okay, sometimes, and it's where I think Jeremiah's counsel is actually really helpful for us here. Because those kinds of movements, those kinds of protests, where we get sponsors and speakers who line up every 5 minutes to share a bit about their organization, those are easy to accommodate for power and easy for power to put down. It is harder to beat something that literally finds its way and an ability to root itself within the larger arc of despair, to root itself there and refuse to be defeated. For the eye of empire, that kind of resistance is just like a weed. You can pull it, you can spray it, you can cut it, but it will keep coming back. For those who believe in a more liberated world, a world that is more just and more fair, that kind of resistance is the beginning of a rose that could spring up even from concrete. It was easy for Bull Connor to unleash dogs and fire hoses on children in Birmingham. It was harder to keep doing it when those kids and their parents kept showing up, when they kept resisting, come what may. In a world filled with the temptations of emperors and dictators, kings and wannabe kings, the call of our faith is clear. Resist, resist, resist. The empire demands something from everyone. It demands that we ignore our thoughts and emotions in favor of what those in power believe or want us to believe. It asks us to embarrass and humiliate others to avoid the same treatment for ourselves. It demands that we ooh and ah at spectacle. And it demands that we ignore the plight of targets of great harm. You do not need me to stand here and recount all the things happening in our world today that fall under the umbrella of empire. There's a question somewhere in all of this about how we're supposed to respond to what's happening in the world. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, and resist empire? Everything is different and nothing has changed. Those who want power over everything else will always follow the exact same playbook. They will attempt to satisfy your basic needs in exchange for submission. They will be prone to displays of grandeur as distraction, and they will offer you a piece of power so long as it's always in relation to and under them. That is not the world that Jesus wanted. It is the world he came to change. The good news of this day is that we are fully human, and what Jesus showed us in this story is that that can be enough to challenge, to imagine, to reimagine, and make anew. The Jesus who was tempted relied upon his faith to see him through. And I'm curious for each of us what stories of our faith, what traditions or rituals that we practice will help root us in a sense of resistance amid all the despair and displacement that we see and feel in the world. I'm curious what hymns or prayers or practices or even people help give us a sense of, this is who I am. This is whose I am. And here is how we ought to be in this world. Because the really weird thing about empire, even though the names might change, the location might change, empire kind of is ever and always. On the flip side of that, I think are folks like us. I think most people who look at every single empire of every single era and say something is really, really wrong here. And they find something within themselves to root themselves as clearly, as comfortably as they can, with the hope, the imagination, that they and folks like them might be able to make something out of nothing, make a way out of no way, find some way to see themselves out, over, and through. In this particular moment, for the history and the life of the church, we have got to answer the question about our relationship to power. I will tell you that I think churches are inherently conservative institutions, not politically, but we exist for the sake of preserving something. That is a conservative impulse. Our faith is not that. There will be times where the demands of the church might actually make it harder for us to engage in our faith, might make it harder for us to resist the temptations of empire. So my prayer is that you will allow your faith to win that particular battle. My hope is that you will be open to the idea that church can also be made anew. That in this particular season where folks all around this country and the world are seeking some place to make meaning of what is happening in the world, that we might simply be like Jesus and rely upon the teachings and traditions of our faith, which are under the church, but not necessarily of the church. We might find our way back to the center, back from where we once came, that we might sit in prayer. We might journey through a labyrinth. We might fast. We might have prayer partners. We might sing old songs and hymns. We might light candles. We might do this really bizarre thing where we break bread and pour wine. We might do all of those things as an act of claiming memory, claiming identity, and rooting ourselves in a kind of resistance that empire will never understand and will never be able to defeat. I pray that each of us might consider on this day and throughout this season of Lent the stories and traditions, the songs, all the things that we might hold on to that will help us find our way out, over, and through between this season of preparation for the days ahead that lead us to the celebration of Easter and resurrection. A day when we look at empire and say, you should be scared. Scared of this now. In this season of Lent, my prayer is that you will find something, not to give up or even to add on, but something that allows you to more fully sit with who you are. One of God's beloved, called to ministry in some way to help build a more just world for all. Amen.